Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Random Musings from the Clinical Trials Guru. It's Dan's Fair. We've got an amazing guest, co-host,
I like that.
Chris Sauber, and then we got Zayd from Kansas City. They're playing our Niners. There's a small game about to happen here soon. I don't know if people have heard of it. It's the Super Bowl.
What? What's this?
It's a small game. People are interested somewhat. Some obscure people. And Zayd, we have never done any kind of video or podcast on labs, and you reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, hey, why haven't you done this? And quite honestly, because I don't know enough about it. So you're here to educate myself and Chris, Guru Nation. You know, we talk about what's central labs, what's a local lab, but we don't get any further than that. Even in our book, we just kind of briefly discuss what's the difference between a central lab and a local lab, and leave it at that. But we're going to go a little bit in depth here for Guru Nation because Zayd's background, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Zayd. Okay, so please, before I mess it up, introduce yourself for Guru Nation.
Sure. So I'm Zayd. My background is actually in molecular biology. So I started off in academia, researching in oncology specifically. So I started off there for 5 years, really enjoyed the idea of researching, finding out essentially new cures, new drugs, new ways to deliver better care for patients. So from there on, I kind of switched off. I went off to a CRO, did a CTA contract, and really enjoyed the idea of clinical trials, how to better educate physicians, providers about the role of clinical trials, essentially. So I did that, and then I really wanted to move back into site management. So currently I'm the director for clinical trials, and I'm mostly focused on late phase studies. So anything phase 2 and 3. So I still dabble in phase 1, but my specialty is phase 2 and 3.
And what kind of a site is this? How many, is it like a small, medium, large site? What kind of a site is this?
Sure. So we're more on the medium toward the large size.
Okay.
So right now we have close to 200 plus studies at various stages. So we're looking at from activation all the way to closure.
Okay.
So I had the FDA audit before. I lived through that. That was definitely intense, showing up and going through rec forms and everything. Had my fair share of pharmaceutical companies coming in, doing site initiation, visiting us, checking feasibility, just seeing if we're able to handle the study. And then, of course, carrying the study out until closure.
I see. Okay, so we can actually talk a lot about that too. I'll be curious to discuss. Let's go even further back. What got you into clinical research?
Really, I kind of really excelled in sciences, specifically biology, but I didn't really want to go the traditional route of getting a biology degree and going to med school. So I wanted to do something a little more different. So I got accepted into a program specifically for clinical lab scientists, so people who actually run all your chemistries, your CBCs, all those tests. So I specialized in that, but I didn't want to do the routine of just standing there and running samples one after the other. So I wanted to move toward more of a creative outlet that research provides.
Okay. And then briefly, give us and because we're going to dive deep into this topic of labs, what was it that you wanted to see more content of? Because the answer is it's all in your head, man. We got to get it out of you and into the cyberspace. So what was the actual issue?
So I was actually at a hematology conference when I messaged you about this, and they were talking about the new studies around leukemia specifically, AML, ALL, and it occurred to me that one of the biggest things they don't really talk about is the sample integrity, which leads to data integrity. So those two things go in hand in hand. So if you don't really have good samples that are being collected for PKs, PDs, then it's kind of garbage in, garbage out, a mindset of if you're not really abating by the protocol, the manuals that are set forth by the sponsor, then you're not really doing a good service for the patient, first of all, and the study and the drug, if it's even going to be making it to pass phase 1, for example.
I see. And how big of an issue is this in the industry? I mean, obviously, it must be pretty big if they're talking about it at conferences.
Sure. And from my view, it seems like it's something really often not really stated by even CRAs who's been in the game for so many years.
Right.
They're always concerned with reactions. If the patient has a reaction, has this been documented? But they don't really go back and say, well, for certain studies, they require a certain set of tubes to be collected when the patient has a reaction. Were those deviated from what the protocol asks? And if so, were they documented? So a lot of times I had sponsors reach out specifically and come to my side and try to find out, well, was this collected in a timely manner according to the protocol? Is there any deviations? How well was it documented? I had an FDA audit where they actually went through each subject folder and checked the lab requisitions and made sure things were actually collected in accordance to the protocol. Sometimes I've seen CRAs who would come through and say, well, was this collected because it was mentioned in the protocol, or was it just an extra collection? And of course, with consent forms, there's a very big no-no if you're collecting things that are not supposed to be collected. So there's a lot of times I felt they were missed by a lot of the information floating out.
I see. So it's more of non-compliance from the site side, and then the CRA not even looking for this.
Yeah.
And I would suspect this would be the case in oncology sites primarily, right, where standard of care and research is kind of blurred lines. I could definitely see that. I mean, we monitor oncology now for our CRO, one small pilot study, and I already see that. We're seeing it, and they're saying, well, can we use the visit 1 lab results to rescreen? They want the patient rescreened, so technically a different patient number. Patient screen failed. They're going to rescreen them with a new number, but now they want to use the lab results from the same patient, but the technically different patient number for the new one, since it's within window. So these kind of things is what you're talking about. That's more of a technical thing, but you're talking about actual that and the fact that the quality of the samples is not good?
Definitely. So one of the things, of course, the sponsor would send out a protocol, and oftentimes with the protocol, there's a lab manual that specifically outlines what needs to be collected, how it needs to be processed. And of course, all that ties back into that drug, making it pass through all the phases to the market. And as you know, sponsors pump so much money into this new drug that they want to get to the market. And when they don't, for example, let's take phase 1 study, you're looking at the safety of the drug. If it's not really, you're not collecting robust data from those samples and showcasing that, yes, there was a reaction, but is it associated with the drug? Is it not? The level of it? And you're not really doing a good job of collecting those samples in a timely manner, then you're really doing a disservice for both the site and the patient at that point.
Yeah, because I definitely can agree with you that CRAs ignore these things. I mean, if anything, they'll look at requisition and make sure the time matches the time on the source document.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, have you heard of this? This is a problem, though.
No, I mean, CRAs, they're typically just making sure the labs were drawn, and that's it. Samples reviewed, yeah, okay, we're good. Let's move on.
Right. So what do you think about this, though? Because they're talking about it in conferences.
Sure. I'm sure that's an issue. I mean, oftentimes our sites send out samples that they're not able to evaluate once they receive them. So, I mean, that's an ongoing issue, I'm sure.
Right.
Sure.
The biggest thing is that, if you miss that, something that seems so practical, but it can, screw up a study is, at a smaller site like this, or, even at one that you managed. If you miss the cutoff time for UPS to come pick it up. I mean, those lab samples you might as well not have collected them. You're going to need to collect new ones.
Well, sometimes they're stable. It depends a lot on the environment and other factors, but if it's 100 degrees out and it's sitting there for 2 days, it's not going to be good by the time it gets to the lab. But if it's cold, you're in Minnesota and it's
no, he's in
30
Kansas
degrees.
City. He's a Chiefs fan.
Sure. Okay, Kansas City. Go Chiefs.
Go Niners. I can turn the hat around.
But, I mean, you're much more likely to have the samples will be good probably for that additional shipping day, right? Probably. But, again, there's no guarantee.
And that's really in my opinion, the difference between a good CRA and a great CRA. A great CRA will be able to really dive into that and understand, is the site capable of carrying on this particular study? A lot of times those things will be skimmed over, and then later on you get all these queries, deviations. And one of the great points, if the patient, for example, is already infused with the chemo drug, that time point already passed. And if that site failed to collect that sample, then that time point is forever passed. So you can't really go back and replicate that time point. So that's oftentimes really the difference between the CRA being able to troubleshoot this issue so it doesn't happen again with the next patient.
Yeah, I think you found a niche here. I mean, so what is your role now? Like, what are you doing right now as of today?
So right now, I'm the director for the late phase clinical trials. So I manage all the collections, all the lab aspects of all these clinical trials. So some study coordinators at different sites, they would be the wheeler dealer, where they're doing the collections, they're doing the consenting, they're following the patient. With our area, it's more divided. So the study coordinator is more focusing on actually coordinating with the patient. My side would actually worry about collection, processing, and then sending out all the samples, talking with the sponsor in terms of queries or if there's any deviations, anything like that. So I manage that aspect of the site.
So that's at site level? Oh, okay, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you said it's like a medium to larger size site, but it's not academic, it's private.
No, it is academic. So
it's academic. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. That makes more sense. Yeah. This is and where I see this as the two biggest problem areas would be, and it makes sense now why you brought it up, oncology and academic institutions. Because at these academic institutions, not just for oncology, but for everything, pretty much, the line is very blurred between research and standard of care.
Sure.
It's similar to oncology. That's the problem with a lot of these academic institutions. I have very limited experience at academic institutions, but I do monitor one, a big one, and I see this all the time. And they're just interchanging. Sometimes they're using external vendors to collect labs because the patient goes to a certain hospital. So now that's study data, but that's also their standard of care, and the sponsor doesn't want to see all those results. So is that a deviation? I mean, technically it is, but also it's standard of care. So which one is it? Because then you didn't collect the right samples for that patient. So this is like very confusing and a complicated issue. Ultimately, as a CRA, we just pass it up to the sponsor. Like, hey, this is what's going on, which is what I did in my report. I put, hey, this is what's happening. Sponsor didn't seem to care, so it's fine. But sometimes you'll get a sponsor that says, no, that's not okay. That's a deviation. Why are they getting their labs done at Kaiser when they're in a study here? And if, in that case, then Pfizer needs to be trained on the protocol, which, by the way, never going to happen. I mean, good luck with that. So what are you going to do there? You're either going to commit deviations every time for this patient, or it's unethical. You can argue it a whole bunch of ways.
Sure, and it really goes back to the point you hit earlier with central lab and standard of care or local labs. At academia, it's a little more difficult because you have a different culture, a different mindset when it comes to clinical trials. So oftentimes really dividing those things and having them understand this has to be collected for central labs because they need to be sent out per the protocol. And then, of course, you have your locals would also need to be collected for local results.
I think you found your niche. I mean, I think you can do like a side gig of a consultant for this kind of stuff, because this nobody's doing it, and nobody has standards, or at least that I've seen. I mean, I monitor a pretty big academic institution. I haven't seen any SOPs on this. They seem to say whatever the patient's going, that's what we're going to use.
Definitely. I mean, I had a lot of CRAs and monitors come through, and you can tell the ones who are experienced because they'll know what to look for, what to ask for, especially at the site initiation visit where they're coming through, they're touring the labs, the facilities, the clinics, looking at calibration records, and the ones who are able to really ask the right questions and be able to understand, are you able to complete the protocol with the least amount of deviations, the least amount of queries? Do you have the population target that we're going after? how are we likely to run into issues? I mean, one of the things is, for example, kit management, the huge aspect of any lab. Are you going to be able to manage the kits where you can have a screening kit on hand without having to worry about being out of those kits, or whether it be visit one or cycle one, however you want to word it? A lot of times I can tell a CRA that's going to be good to work with, where they're on the ball, they're able to communicate quickly, efficiently, versus a CRA that might take a week to get back to you. And by then, the issue's even bigger.
Right. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing really to add. I mean, he's absolutely correct.
I think it's the tidbits for our like this people that want to break into the CRA industry. Like, I don't know, maybe our CRA Academy students. You know, these are great, especially if you're going to go interview an academic institution. Okay, these are great pointers you're getting. So give them like 3 tips. Like, what would you think would be a good CRA at a SIV, for example? Like, what kind of question would they ask?
So one of the good questions is to really understand the capability of the site that you're going to be going at. Does that mean, for example, dedicated staff? If you're going to send an email to the regulation department, are you going to get an answer, and how long and how fast are you going to get the answer? I mean, one of the issues I run into, you would send an email saying, hey, is the TMF complete? Or do you have the consent forms up to date? What's the timeline in terms of the IRB, the activation? If it takes a long time as a CRA, that's really wasting your time, and you're grinding out time until you get that answer. Unfortunately, there are roadblocks that you have to clear before a study is active at the site. So that's one aspect, is just to see what's the capability of the site as a whole. A second one is just being able to see the actual facilities. It's one thing to hear them talk about it and say, this is what we have, A, B, and C, but to actually go there and see it. Because you don't want to show up and realize, for example, the lab is just a hole in the wall, and they're not practicing good GCP or even any good practicing in terms of lab standards. So that's one issue at least from a lab perspective. The other thing is just being able to see the study coordinators and gauging their ability to, again, communicate effectively with you. I'm a big fan of effective communication. It's one thing to communicate, but can you do it effectively? Can you get the answer in the least amount of emails? If you're getting more than 10 emails to just answer a question, then at that time that's being wasted.
Mm-hmm. That's great tips. Now, I think you found a niche here that you can really take, create more opportunities for you and your organization, actually. But let's go back now to when you started out. So you started out in the private sector, mm-hmm. right? And then you moved to academia. That's not unusual. Which one do you prefer more now that you've been in both?
Each one has its advantages and disadvantages. With academia, there's a bit less restrictive rules about what you can and can't do. You're able to change processes a lot easier, which is something really overlooked.
Chris is blown away right now because his whole world.
I would think it's the exact opposite.
His whole world upside down. Just like when the Chiefs are going to lose, the whole world will be upside down. So what do you mean? Can you explain? What are you confused about, Chris?
I would think that they're much more rigid in terms of rules and regulations at an academic unit opposed to a private institution.
Well, one of the things I found out when I came to academia, especially with clinical trials, the core processes about getting things done, it's easier to change in terms of, for example, let's say the workflow isn't really accommodating for how the patients are being seen. So with that, you can change it just because you have a little more give about taking it up to someone higher that can actually change it for you. In the private sector, because I was with one CRO, it's a big one that kind of merged, and now it goes by acronyms. Let's just say that.
But letters of the alphabet.
Yeah. So I was with them, and they were very rigid in terms of what needs to be done and how fast things need to be done. Of course, everything was timed, how much time you're putting into study X, study Y.
Yes.
But that was just my experience with them and versus where I'm at now.
I can actually see that because it makes sense the more I think about it. I think the academic institutions have more loopholes when they're doing private industry sponsored studies, as opposed to private sites. I think also when they're the sponsor themselves, like many times the academic institution is the sponsor. Obviously,
Sure.
they can do whatever they want because it's their study. So I think that's kind of what he means. But yeah, overall, I think the structure is more rigid at an academic institution than a private site. But in the context of like the entire study, you could probably get away with a lot more at an academic institution because you can say, well, our SOPs say this, our IRB says this, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Sure, I'll give you an example. Like we had an example where we had a sponsor who specifically asked for tissue blocks to be released from pathology. So our guidelines for our pathology department is that we don't release blocks. So they had to actually accept us cutting slides and send those in for tumor assessment. So we were able to kind of change that and say, hey, this is our protocol. This is what we go off of.
That's very interesting. So you've been through FDA audit as well, both at the site, at the private site and the academic site, or was it just the one?
Just the academic.
Just the academic institution. And so I imagine the FDA, if it's a large academic institution, they go often to these kind of places, right?
So with us, this is actually the first one we actually ended up getting audited for.
Okay.
But it was more of the sponsors end that it kind of came about. But because we were a high enrolling site,
yeah,
we were kind of picked on.
What I'm curious now. So because so it's hard to like answer this, I guess, in a holistic sense, because from the 100,000 whatever studies there are right now in the U.S. that are enrolling or not yet enrolling, a lot of those are academic institutions, and a lot of those are just one study, one site studies, right, which are academic institutions. But over the years, we've seen the market share, if you take all the studies in general, the market share is increasing in favor of private sites. But academic sites are doing more of these one-off studies, like, hey, or they're like the pillar site for the study, and then they might partner with private sites, either in their community or maybe across the country, however they set it up. So do you think academia is gaining market share in clinical trials or losing?
It depends on what viewpoint you want to look at. So I noticed with academia, it's gaining ground in terms of having more access to patients.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be more of depending on the academia. For example, if you have a university and attached to it is a hospital, that gives you a lot of ground to cover. You have the provider's buy-in, and that's one of the biggest ones. I believe you talked about it, recruiting patients to clinical trials. When your providers are kind of into it and they're interested in the study and they want to run the study through your site, then that's a stronger way to get your patient enrollment in. Of course, the flip side of that, the processes may not be as fine-tuned as a private site where things run a little more smoother. They know what is the capabilities. They have more of a marketing PR behind it of how to recruit their patients. So it kind of depends on what viewpoint you're looking at. Again, with academia, there's a few different pluses in terms of the investigator can actually initiate their own study if they're interested in it. Yeah. And with those particular studies, it gives you the ability to really cultivate how the study should go about. So it gives you more of that creative outlet of less structure of figuring out, okay, this is what we want to go at, here's what we want to do. And recruiting the patients, going through the protocol, changing it, new amendment, new protocols. It can be easily, I wouldn't say a lot easier, but definitely a bit easier than the usual of getting it passed, since you can change it and you have all the protocols at hand.
Right. It makes sense because in the last couple of years, maybe the last 5 years, I've been noticing a trend of these academic institutions partnering with local physicians, like either like loose alliance or they're just outright acquiring them. And then now they work for the university, but they're still private when they need to be, but they are also part of the greater umbrella. So that is interesting to see how that will play out, because I'm asking because a lot of our students or even prospective students or people that want to get in the industry, they're thinking, and they should be thinking these things, what's better, industry, private industry or academia? My answer is whatever is going to hire you first. Just get the experience under your belt. But it's interesting to see in the long run where this is going. I think maybe market share increases for both somehow, because the amount of studies is increasing overall every year. This year, 2020 is going to be even bigger than 2019 is supposed to be for clinical research. I'm sure you're seeing that. You guys are probably busy as ever over there. Now, I wanted to ask, virtual trials, okay? Are academic institutions participating more in these kind of virtual trials, or are they against it?
It really depends, because with mine, everything it can't be virtual. So I can't really speak much about that in terms of that, because my niche is oncology, clinical trials. So those all have to be kind of in face, and the monitoring has to be, at least the monitor has to be in person.
Good point.
In terms of remote monitoring, there are some studies I ran into, but they were very limited. You can look at maybe prevention studies more than anything, but with those heavy duty where it's a new drug, it's a phase 1 study, and they're trying to look at the safety of it, you're going to want boots on the ground of being able to come through, check everything.
Yeah. Now for the sites, because we've helped the job seekers out, hopefully. I mean, you guys are going to sound so much more educated now in your interviews. You've got tips from Zayd. Now for the sites, okay, let's talk to the private sites out there. If you're a private site and you're next to a large academic institution, like, for example, let's take your case without mentioning where you work. I actually have to look at where you work. I can't remember right now, but it's an academic institution. So if I had a site across the street from you and I came to you and said, hey, Zayd, we do oncology studies here too. We have community-based oncologists. A lot of them are affiliated with your institution. Is there a way we can maybe do a study that where you guys are the sponsor? Is there opportunities for sites, or should they just ignore this?
I mean, it's definitely a potential to tap into. I mean, one of the nice things about partnering with even a bigger site, a bigger academia, is that you don't have to spend the money for the infrastructure. You can utilize the resources and have it a kind of mutual benefit between both sides and the academia, so to speak, the private and the academia sector.
Yeah.
So it really ties back into what can you really offer to them that they don't have.
Exactly. And what do you think that is? What does academia need that private sites have? What do you think that would be?
Honestly, it really goes back to that broad idea of research and the culture that comes with it. With the academia, since things are run a little more different in terms of how research is being looked at, it could be a little more difficult to get the buy-in from the nursing staff, for example. I mean, you look at a private site where everybody there is there for that one common goal, versus more of an academia where you're partnering with the hospital that you're affiliated with, you're attached with, and having to kind of cross over that cultural barrier of, okay, we're doing the standard of care, but now there's a layer of research on top of it. Oftentimes you run to the saying of, well, you're making me do extra work. Well, it's not extra work if you're taking, let's say, 2 more vitals because the study requires you to take a vitals pre and post dose. That's kind of the biggest hurdle really at the academia sites of being able to really accept the idea that research is here and is just part of treatment now.
I definitely see that. Another strategy academia uses is have personnel that just do research and then personnel that just do standard of care. So there's no confusion. I mean, there's different, I guess, strategies for them, but just interesting to think about as a private site owner, how to potentially collaborate with academic institution if it's near your area or in your area, and maybe your PI knows colleagues that work there. How there's got to be ways to collaborate. Actually, we wrote a white paper on this. But we're going to publish it, actually. We're going to have a magazine coming out, Clinical Scoop magazine. It's finally going to launch. And I wrote a white paper on how academia can utilize private research sites or private clinics to do more research there. So it's kind of related to what you were saying about, I guess the challenge at academia is convincing the nurses, hey, you're not doing extra work. This is a study. You just take the vital signs before and after instead of before, because they keep doing it before and not after, deviation after deviation after deviation. These nurses don't really care. They're like, I'm treating my patient. What do you want? Some of these are not even on delegation log because the SOP said they don't have to be.
True.
Right? So they're like, hey, I'm not even on any document, so I'm out of here. So maybe there is some opportunities there for the sites, but the white paper is coming out. But for those that are really curious, it's on Medium as well. Just go on there. You'll see it. You remember this thing?
I do.
Huge. I spent 30 hours writing this thing, and they rejected us. They didn't even read it. They said, we're no longer interested in this project. But first, they wanted the request.
Oh, wow.
See, I just think they wanted that info, man. That's what I'm starting to think. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I think that's what they wanted. But it's okay. We publish it. Magazine. And now maybe somebody's going to read it and say, hey, this is actually good. These guys know what they're talking about. And Zayd over here is talking about lab samples. This is our problem. Let's give Zayd a call. So
absolutely,
this is how things work in a 2020 world.
Exactly.
What a time to be alive.
And that's the catch. One of the things you were talking about, a lot of the ones who are trying to get their foot in the door, it really boils down to that persistence of constantly saying, okay, I'm not going to take that no, reach for another. Even like for me, I got in as a CTA, clinical trial assistant at the time, and I had the option of moving into the CRA role. There was an in-house CRA or a project management, but I didn't really want to go that route. I kind of changed tracks and wanted to go more on the site level. But it all starts, you got to put in your time as like anybody else. You can't really just start off at that level. You have to have the experience. And, one of the things is it's all builds on itself. You have to have that foundation understanding of what it is to do clinical trials. Even in, getting the enough years to be able to sit and take your SOCRA exam, for example.
Right.
And that'll add more to your resume, so to speak.
I'm fascinated. So you strike me as like an entrepreneur, and people who are like entrepreneurs that work at or large organizations are called intrapreneurs. But are there more people like you in academia? Because when I go, I don't meet people like you.
Interestingly enough, we lose quite a bit of our staff to become CRAs, to go to the pharmaceutical side. So it's interesting. In my opinion, it's easier to kind of go in through the university route, through the academia side, get the experience, and then switch over. It doesn't work all the time, of course, but it gives you that experience of saying, hey, I know what I'm talking about when it comes to clinical trials, or having a little bit of an idea about it. So I want to say in the last 2 years, we had 15 people leave.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's advice for the students or anyone watching. Maybe academia is your golden ticket, right? We know an academic center that's always taking our interns, and maybe that's why, there's a lot of turnover here. I didn't realize there's that much turnover in academia. I thought it was the opposite.
Yeah, so a lot of people would come in, let's say you don't have any experience, nothing whatsoever. You can come in as a data coordinator. So essentially doing all the data for a study coordinator. So filling out the ECRFs, checking, making sure things are getting collected, talking with the sponsors at some level. And then, of course, you put in some time there and you can move up to that steady coordinator where you're actually managing it. You become a lead. Of course, by that time, definitely try to sit and take your SOCRA exam. I believe they're changing the exam from the last time I took it. I think they took out the case questions, if I remember correctly.
Oh, okay.
But it's definitely a good way to at least get that experience where if you want to go that CRA route or you want to go become a monitor, at least you have a little bit of experience where you can get your foot in the door.
What an excellent piece of advice for those of you who stuck around to the end. You see, this became I knew it was going to be an excellent episode. Actually, Zayd, we got to do more because we'll do more follow-ups on different topics. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opportunities within academia as well. So, I think you kind of changed our perspective today as to private industry people, like for life. But I just dabble a little bit with academia, like a few interactions. But you changed some of my perspective for sure, maybe even Chris's as well. And hopefully the viewers out there watching. So if people want to reach out to you, I will put your LinkedIn profile underneath the YouTube and in the podcast show notes. And we're going to have to do more because we can do like 3 hours on this. I mean, this is such a deep topic we can get into. One just won't do it justice. So we're going to have to do more. Anytime, you're welcome back, and let's do more of these, Zayd. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you letting me get this chance to speak with you. I definitely followed you throughout the year, so to speak, when I was first starting, so you put out a lot of good info. So.
Thank you. I really hope you come back, even when the Niners beat you guys. I know you're going to be mad for a little bit, but then get over it, and then we'll do another one. Okay? It's going to be okay. It'll be okay.
All right.
Chris
if you
will suffer
so.
with you. Chris will suffer with you as a Chiefs fan.
Apparently,
he's a Chiefs fan now.
I like the Chiefs better than the 49ers.
He's all of a sudden a Chiefs fan. So what do you know? And he's a Raider fan. How does that even make sense? That makes zero sense. But anyways, Zayd, what a pleasure, man. I appreciate it. I think you're onto something here. I don't think people are looking, at this issue with the bad lab samples that we started it off with. But then it opened it up to a whole discussion on academia versus private, and I'd like to continue that going forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Zayd.
And thank you everyone for watching and listening, and catch you all later. Bye-bye.